"You're a failure, Dad. Mom's new husband isn't. He has money," my son said at the family dinner. I stayed silent because that very same day, I had signed a contract that made me a billionaire. When he found out, his reaction was priceless. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm David, and at 61 years old, I thought I had experienced every possible form of heartbreak. I was wrong. The dining room of my ex-wife Margaret's house felt suffocating that Sunday evening. The mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier Richard had installed after their marriage 5 years ago. Everything in that house screamed money. From the Italian marble floors to the original paintings hanging on cream-colored walls, I sat in the chair farthest from the head of the table, where Richard presided like a king over his domain. My son Dennis, 35 and my only child, was explaining his latest business venture with the animated enthusiasm he reserved for conversations with his stepfather. His wife Sarah nodded along, occasionally glancing at her phone. Their 2 children, my grandchildren Emma and Jake, ages 8 and 10, barely acknowledged my presence. "The startup has incredible potential," Dennis said, cutting into his prime rib. "We're looking at expansion into 3 major markets by next year." Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine. "Sounds promising. What kind of capital are we talking about?" I watched this exchange in silence, feeling like a ghost at my own family's table. Dennis had invited me to these monthly dinners out of obligation, not love. Everyone knew it. The conversation flowed around me as if I weren't there. "Well," Dennis hesitated, "we need about 200,000 to really make it work. The investors are interested, but they want to see more skin in the game." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "That's substantial. What's your timeline?" As they discussed numbers and projections, I felt the familiar weight in my jacket pocket. The contract I had signed that morning seemed to burn against my chest. $2.8 billion. The number was so absurd I almost couldn't believe it myself. Margaret finally noticed my silence. "David, you're quiet tonight. How's the shop?" The shop, my small auto repair business that barely kept the lights on. The place where I worked 12-hour days, covered in grease and sweat, trying to scrape together enough money to feel worthy of my son's attention. "It's fine," I said simply. Dennis looked up from his plate, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Disappointment, embarrassment. "Dad still thinks he can compete with the big chains," he said with a laugh that cut deeper than any knife. "But hey, at least he's consistent." Sarah giggled, covering her mouth with her napkin. Richard maintained his diplomatic smile, but I caught the look of pity in his eyes. "Dennis," Margaret warned softly, but there was no real reproach in her voice. My son wasn't finished. He set down his fork and looked directly at me, his voice gaining confidence from the audience. "You know what, Dad? I'm tired of pretending. You're a failure. You've always been a failure." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. 35 years of raising this boy, of sacrificing everything I had, and this was my reward. "Richard here," Dennis continued, gesturing toward his stepfather. "He built an empire. Real estate, investments, multiple businesses. He provided for this family when you couldn't." I watched Richard shift uncomfortably in his chair. To his credit, he looked genuinely embarrassed by Dennis's outburst, but he didn't stop it. "Dennis, that's enough," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. "No, Mom, it's not enough. I'm 35 years old, and I've spent my entire adult life watching Dad struggle with that pathetic little shop while Richard showed me what real success looks like." Dennis's voice grew louder, more animated. "Richard paid for my college, my wedding, helped us buy our house. What has Dad ever given me except disappointment?" Emma and Jake stared at their plates, clearly uncomfortable. Sarah continued scrolling through her phone, as if this family drama was just background noise. I felt something die inside me in that moment. Not my love for Dennis. That would probably never fade completely. But my hope that someday he might see me as worthy of his respect. "Richard doesn't just talk about success," Dennis continued on a roll now. "He lives it. He's what a real father should be." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the soft clink of silverware against china as people pretended to eat. Richard finally spoke. his voice careful and measured. "Dennis, I think perhaps—" "What?" Dennis snapped. "We're all thinking it. Dad's a 61-year-old man who still gets his hands dirty for minimum wage while you're closing million-dollar deals. It's embarrassing." I looked around the table at these people who were supposed to be my family. Margaret avoided my eyes, focusing intently on her salad. Sarah was now openly texting. The children seemed to shrink into their chairs. Richard looked like he wanted to disappear. And Dennis? My son stared at me with a mixture of anger and disgust that took my breath away. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. Every eye in the room followed my movement. "Thank you for dinner," I said quietly to Margaret. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow, distant. "David, wait," she began, but I was already moving toward the door. Dennis called after me, his tone mocking. "That's right, Dad. Run away. That's what you do best." I paused at the threshold, my hand on the doorframe. For a moment I considered turning around, considered telling them about the contract in my pocket, about the technology I had developed in the back room of my shop, about the $2.8 billion deal I had closed while Dennis was probably getting his morning latte, but I didn't. Something held me back. Pride, maybe, or the knowledge that anything I said now would sound desperate, like the ravings of a broken man trying to salvage his dignity. Instead, I walked out into the cool evening air, climbed into my 15-year-old pickup truck, and drove home to my modest apartment above the shop. As I sat in my kitchen later that night, staring at the contract spread across my scratched table, I realized that Dennis had given me something valuable after all, clarity. For the first time in years, I saw our relationship for what it truly was. I wasn't his father anymore. I was just the man who had disappointed him for 35 years. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, while Dennis's words echoed in my mind like a broken record. "You're a failure. You've always been a failure." The irony wasn't lost on me. At 3 a.m, I got up and made coffee, then sat at my kitchen table with the contract spread before me. $2.8 billion. The number looked surreal in the harsh fluorescent light of my tiny kitchen. I had been working on the hybrid engine technology for 12 years, ever since Margaret and I divorced. While Dennis was learning to prefer Richard's company over mine, I was spending my nights in the back room of my shop, tinkering with designs that everyone said were impossible. But impossible had become reality, and 3 major automotive companies had engaged in a bidding war that ended with a contract that would change my life forever. The first payment, $250 million, would arrive in my account within 30 days. As I sipped my coffee, memories flooded back. Not the good ones. Those were too painful right now, but the moments that had led to last night's humiliation. Dennis was 12 when Margaret and I separated. I remember the day she told me she was leaving, standing in this very kitchen when it was still part of our house on Maple Street. "I can't do this anymore, David," she had said, her voice tired rather than angry. "You work all the time, and when you're here, you're still thinking about that shop. Dennis barely knows you." I had protested, of course. I worked those long hours for them, to provide for my family, but Margaret shook her head. "Richard offers stability. He can give Dennis opportunities you never could." Richard Thornton, even then, before they were married, he was already in the picture. A successful real estate developer with houses in 3 states and an investment portfolio that dwarfed my annual income. The custody arrangement gave me Dennis every other weekend and 1 evening during the week. But as the months passed, those visits became increasingly strained. Dennis would spend our time together talking about Richard's boat, Richard's country club, the vacation Richard was planning to take them on. I tried to compete. God help me, I tried. I took out loans to take Dennis to expensive restaurants, bought him gifts I couldn't afford, planned elaborate outings that left me exhausted and broke. But a man working 60-hour weeks at a repair shop couldn't compete with someone who made more in a month than I did in a year. The worst part was watching Dennis learn to be ashamed of me. It happened gradually, so slowly I almost didn't notice at first. He stopped telling his friends about our weekends together. He began making excuses to cut our visits short. When he turned 16 and could drive himself, he started forgetting our scheduled times together. I remember his high school graduation. I sat in the back of the auditorium, watching my son walk across the stage to receive his diploma. When they announced that Dennis Thornton, he had taken Richard's name by then, would be attending Harvard University. The crowd erupted in applause. Harvard. Paid for by Richard, of course. I had offered to help, scraping together what little I could. But Dennis had looked at me with something approaching pity. Thanks, Dad, but Richard's got it covered. You should save your money. Save my money. As if the few $1,000s I could offer would make any difference in a world where tuition cost more than I made in 2 years. College was when I lost him completely. He would come home for holidays, but his visits to my shop became increasingly rare. He had internships at Richard's companies, connections through Richard's network, opportunities that opened doors I didn't even know existed. When Dennis announced his engagement to Sarah, he asked Richard to be his best man. Not me, Richard. The man who had been in his life for 8 years versus the man who had changed his diapers, taught him to ride a bike, and held him when he cried from nightmares. I attended the wedding as a guest, sitting in the third row behind Richard's extended family and business associates. During the reception, Dennis made a speech thanking Richard for being the father figure who showed him what success really meant. I left early that night, too. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of work and loneliness. I threw myself into my technology project, partly because I genuinely believed in it, but mostly because it was the only thing that made me feel like I might still have something valuable to offer the world. Dennis's children barely knew me. Emma and Jake called me Grandpa David, in the careful, polite way children use with strangers they're told they should respect. They called Richard Papa with genuine affection. I tried to be present for birthdays and holidays, always bringing gifts that seemed modest compared to what Richard provided. A bike from me versus a trip to Disney World from him. A toy train set versus a college fund. Last Christmas, I had watched Jake unwrap the model airplane kit I had carefully chosen, only to set it aside immediately when Richard presented him with a real remote-controlled drone. The boy forgot about my gift entirely. These monthly dinners had started 2 years ago, Margaret's idea for keeping the family connected, but they felt more like endurance tests, exercises in polite tolerance where everyone waited for me to finish eating so the real conversation could begin. And now, sitting in my kitchen at dawn, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I had been fighting a war I could never win. It wasn't about money, not really. Richard could have been a construction worker, and Dennis would have preferred him because Richard represented everything I wasn't. Confident, socially connected, emotionally unavailable in ways that somehow made him more appealing rather than less. But money had become the language of worthiness in our family, and in that language, I had been mute for 35 years. As the sun rose over the shop, painting my small apartment in golden light, I made a decision. I folded the contract carefully and placed it in my safe next to my will and the deed to the building. For now, my secret would remain exactly that. A secret. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to understand something first. When the money came, when I could afford to compete with Richard's lifestyle, would that change anything? Or would Dennis find new reasons to dismiss me? I had a feeling I already knew the answer, but I needed to be certain. Because if love could be bought, someone should have told me the price was higher than I thought. The coffee had grown cold in my cup, but I finished it anyway, bitter dregs and all. Outside, the city was waking up, people heading to jobs and lives that made sense to them. Soon, I would open my shop and spend another day fixing other people's broken machines while my own broken heart counted down the days until everything changed. 30 days until the first payment arrived. 30 days to decide what kind of man I wanted to be when I was no longer just a failure in my son's eyes. The weight of possibility was almost as heavy as the weight of disappointment I had carried for so long. 28 days after the contract signing, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. I was already in the shop, organizing inventory before opening, when I saw Dennis's name on the caller ID. My heart jumped. He never called this early, and rarely called at all unless he needed something. Dad? His voice sounded strained, different from the confident tone he had used during that disastrous dinner. Dennis, what's wrong? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. He paused, and I heard traffic in the background. Are you sick? The question caught me off guard. Sick? No. Why would you think that? Richard mentioned seeing you at Dr. Morrison's office last week. The oncologist. He was there with a client who's selling his practice. I almost laughed. Dr. Morrison wasn't treating me for cancer. He was one of the investors in my technology, and we had been discussing the medical applications of my hybrid engine designs for emergency vehicles. But Dennis didn't know that, and his concern was the first genuine emotion I had heard from him in months. "I'm not sick, son. I was there on business." "Business?" The skepticism in his voice was familiar, but there was something else too. Relief, maybe. "Yes, business. I know that's hard for you to believe." There was a long pause. "Dad, look, I know things have been difficult between us lately. If you're going through something serious, I want to know about it." For a moment, I almost told him everything. About the contract, about the money that would arrive in my account in 2 days, about the validation I had been seeking for decades. But something held me back. "I'm fine, Dennis." "Really?" He sighed. "Okay. But if you need anything, I'll be fine." After he hung up, I stood in my shop thinking about that conversation. The first time in years that Dennis had called me just to check on me, and it was because he thought I might be dying. What did that say about our relationship? 2 days later, at exactly 9:37 in the morning, my phone chimed with a banking notification. I was under the hood of a Honda Civic, but I stopped what I was doing and checked the message. Account deposit, $50 million. The first installment. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. $50 million. More money than I had ever imagined having, and it was just the beginning. I closed the shop early that day and drove to my bank. The manager, Mrs. Patterson, nearly fell out of her chair when she saw the balance on my account. "Mr. Thornton, this is quite unusual. We'll need to verify these funds, of course, and discuss investment options." "That won't be necessary right now," I said calmly. "But I would like to open a separate investment account." Of course. May I ask the nature of this deposit?" "A business transaction." She nodded rapidly, probably thinking about the commission the bank would make on managing this kind of money. "We have private banking services for high net worth clients. I can arrange for you to meet with our wealth management team. Maybe later. For now, I just want the money safely invested." That evening, I sat in my apartment above the shop, looking out at the street below. Nothing had changed. Same cracked sidewalk, same flickering street light, same modest neighborhood where I had lived for 15 years. But everything felt different. I could buy Richard's house. I could buy 10 houses like Richard's house. I could send Emma and Jake to the finest schools in the world. Fund Dennis's business ventures without blinking. Travel anywhere I wanted to go. But what I wanted most was something money couldn't buy. The respect of my son. 3 days later, Dennis called again. This time, his voice was animated with excitement. "Dad, I wanted to let you know, we're moving forward with the expansion. Richard agreed to back us for the full $200,000. I felt something twist in my stomach. "Congratulations. It's a loan, of course, with reasonable terms. But this is going to change everything for us. Sarah's already looking at houses in better neighborhoods." I gripped the phone tighter. "Dennis, before you sign anything with Richard, let me ask you something. What if I told you I could help with financing?" He laughed, not unkindly, but with the patient amusement of someone humoring a child. "Dad, I appreciate the offer, but we're talking about serious money here. $200,000. I understand that. Do you? Because that's more than your shop makes in 3 years. I know exactly what $200,000 means." His tone shifted, becoming more gentle but somehow more condescending. "Look, I know you want to help, and maybe someday, when the business is established, you could invest a small amount. But right now, we need reliable backing from someone with a proven track record, someone like Richard." He didn't say it, but the implication hung between us like a blade. "Dennis, what if I told you I could match Richard's offer? Same terms, same timeline." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Dad," he said finally, "where would you get that kind of money? Does it matter where if I have it?" "Of course it matters. I'm not taking out a loan for you, and I'm not going to let you mortgage the shop or do something stupid. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm offering to invest in your business." "With what money?" His voice was rising now, tinged with frustration. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Richard and I have already discussed the terms. The paperwork is ready. This is happening. But you haven't signed yet." "No, but..." "Then let me make you a counteroffer. I'll provide the $200,000 at 1% lower interest than whatever Richard is charging, with more flexible repayment terms." Dennis's laugh was sharp, almost angry. "Stop it. Just stop. I know you mean well, but this fantasy where you're some kind of secret millionaire is getting embarrassing." The words hit me like a slap. Fantasy, embarrassing. Dennis, Dad, I love you, but you need to accept reality. You're a good mechanic, but you're not a businessman. You're not Richard, and that's okay. But please don't pretend to be something you're not. He hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, feeling a familiar hollow ache in my chest. Even when I offered to help, even when I had the means to help, Dennis couldn't see me as anything other than the failure he had decided I was. That night, I went online and researched Richard's real estate empire. It was impressive, no doubt about it. Multiple properties, successful developments, a net worth estimated somewhere in the 50 to 70 million range. Substantial money, serious money, but not $2.8 billion serious. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. Below, my modest shop sat dark and quiet. In 2 weeks, I would receive another installment. $100 million this time. In 6 months, when all payments were complete, I would be wealthier than Richard could ever dream of becoming. But my son still saw me as a failure, and apparently no amount of money would change that, unless I found a way to make it impossible for him to ignore the truth. The question was, did I want Dennis to love me for who I really was, or was I willing to settle for his respect based on what I could provide? As I prepared for bed, I realized I might not have a choice. Dennis had made his decision about Richard's loan, just as he had made his decision about me years ago. Now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The contract in my safe felt heavier than ever, weighted with possibilities I was only beginning to understand. 3 months passed. 3 months of watching Dennis post photos on social media of his expanding business, his new office space, his grateful comments about Richard's mentorship and support. 3 months of receiving payments that had already totaled over $400 million. 3 months of living a double life that was eating me alive. I had started making small changes. Nothing dramatic. I still lived above the shop, still worked on cars every day. But I had quietly purchased the entire building, along with the 2 adjacent properties. I had hired 2 additional mechanics, both skilled professionals who were grateful for steady work and excellent benefits. My shop was now the best equipped facility in a 50-mile radius. Dennis never noticed. He drove past my shop occasionally. I could see his route to the new office took him right by my street, but he never stopped. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was reviewing investment portfolios that my new financial advisor had prepared when my phone rang. Margaret's number flashed on the screen. "David, I need to talk to you." Her voice was tight, controlled in the way it got when she was barely holding herself together. "What's wrong?" "It's Richard. Can you meet me for coffee, somewhere private?" An hour later, I sat across from my ex-wife in a small cafe downtown. Margaret looked older than her 58 years, with worry lines etched deep around her eyes. "Richard's company is in trouble," she said without preamble. "Serious trouble." I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of trouble?" "The real estate market has been shifting, and he made some aggressive investments last year, leveraged everything." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "We might lose the house, David. Everything." I processed this information carefully. "How much trouble are we talking about?" "He owes about $12 million. The bank wants their money by the end of the month, or they start seizing assets." $12 million. 6 months ago, that number would have been impossibly large to me. Now it was less than 3% of what I already had in liquid assets. "Does Dennis know?" Margaret shook her head. "Richard doesn't want to worry him. But David, Dennis's business loan from Richard, it's at risk. If Richard goes under, Dennis loses everything he's invested." I felt a cold rage building in my chest. Not at Richard exactly, but at the situation. My son had rejected my help, had chosen Richard's proven track record over his own father's offer. And now that decision was about to destroy him. "Why are you telling me this, Margaret?" She looked down at her coffee. "Because despite everything that's happened between us, I know you still love Dennis. And because maybe I finally understand that Richard isn't the hero I thought he was." "What do you mean?" "He hid this from me, David. The debt, the risk, everything. I found out by accident when the bank called looking for him. He's been lying for months." Her voice cracked slightly. I feel like such a fool. I reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. You're not a fool. You believed what he told you, the same way Dennis believes what he tells him. She looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen in her eyes in years. Respect. You never lied to us, David. You worked yourself half to death trying to provide, but you never pretended to be something you weren't. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Margaret asked the question I had been dreading. Is there any way you could help? I know it's asking a lot given how Dennis has treated you, but how much would it take to save Richard's business? She blinked, surprised by the directness of my question. I don't know exactly. 15 million, maybe 20. And Dennis's investment? He put in 50,000 of his own money, plus the 200,000 loan from Richard. If Richard's company collapses, Dennis loses everything and still owes the loan. I nodded slowly. $250,000 to save my son from financial ruin. Less than I had made in interest the previous week. Let me think about it. Margaret's eyes widened. David, you don't have that kind of... She stopped herself, studying my face. Do you? I didn't answer directly. If I could help, would Dennis accept it? I don't know. His pride. She trailed off. But if the alternative is losing everything, he might not have a choice. That evening, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. I called my lawyer, James Crawford, whom I had retained when the money started flowing in. James was discreet, competent, and had helped me establish a complex network of trusts and shell companies to manage my new wealth. James, I need you to set up a deal. Anonymous investor wants to buy out Richard Thornton's debts and offer him a partnership opportunity. How anonymous? Completely. Richard will never know who's behind it. Make it look like a standard private equity transaction. What kind of terms are you thinking? Generous? Clear his debts, give him a path to rebuild, but structure it so Dennis's business loan gets converted to a direct investment in Dennis's company instead. Essentially, you want to become your son's silent business partner. Exactly. James was quiet for a moment. David, are you sure about this? If Dennis ever finds out... He won't. Not unless I decide to tell him. 2 weeks later, Richard called me. His voice was lighter than I had heard it in months. David, the strangest thing happened. A private equity firm approached me out of nowhere. They want to bail out my company and offer me a partnership deal. That's great news, Richard. It really is. And the best part is they're restructuring Dennis's loan as a direct investment in his business. He's going to come out of this in much better shape than when he went in. I made appropriate sounds of surprise and congratulation while fighting back a bitter smile. Margaret must be relieved. She is. We all are. It's like a miracle, honestly. This firm, Meridian Capital, they seem to specialize in exactly these kinds of situations. Meridian Capital, one of my shell companies, named after the street where I had my first apartment after the divorce. James had done excellent work making it look legitimate. Well, you've always been good at landing on your feet, I said. I suppose so. Listen, David, I know things have been tense lately, especially with Dennis, but I want you to know that I've never wanted to replace you as his father. The words were kind, probably sincere, but they came 20 years too late. I appreciate that, Richard. Maybe we can all get together soon, celebrate the good news. Maybe. After he hung up, I sat in my shop office, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal. I had just spent $15 million to save the man who had replaced me in my son's affections, and I felt no satisfaction from it whatsoever, because I knew what would happen next. Dennis would credit Richard with securing this miraculous deal. Richard would accept the praise, probably genuinely believing he had earned it, and I would remain exactly what I had always been in my son's eyes, irrelevant. But something had changed in me during these months of wealth. I no longer needed Dennis's approval the way I once had. The money hadn't bought me love, but it had bought me something perhaps more valuable, perspective. I was no longer the desperate father begging for scraps of attention. I was a man who could reshape lives with a phone call, who had already saved my son's future without him even knowing it. The question now was whether Dennis would ever be ready to see who his father really was, or if he would spend the rest of his life believing in a version of me that had never really existed. Either way, I was no longer waiting for his permission to be proud of myself. The empire I had built in secret was real, substantial, and growing every day. Whether my son ever acknowledged it or not was becoming less important than I had ever imagined possible. But I wasn't finished yet. There was still one more revelation coming, one that would force Dennis to confront everything he thought he knew about success, failure, and the man he had dismissed as a disappointment. The only question was whether he would be ready for the truth when it finally arrived. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after that devastating dinner. I was under the hood of a Mercedes when I heard Dennis's voice shouting my name from the front of the shop. Dad, where are you?" Something in his tone made me drop my wrench and walk quickly to the front office. Dennis stood there, his face flushed, holding what looked like a financial magazine. Behind him, Sarah waited by their car, engine running. "We need to talk," he said, his voice shaking with something between anger and disbelief. "Okay, what about?" He held up the magazine, Forbes, and I felt my stomach drop. The cover story was about emerging technology entrepreneurs, and somehow, despite all my efforts to stay anonymous, my name was prominently featured. David Thornton, the 61-year-old mechanic who revolutionized green technology, Dennis read aloud. Net worth estimated at $2.8 billion. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. "Dad, what the hell is this?" I wiped my hands on my coveralls, buying time. "Where did you get that?" "Richard saw it at his office. One of his clients brought it in, said he recognized the name." Dennis's voice was rising. "Is this real? Are you really worth almost $3 billion? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not joy or pride but rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. "Yes," I said simply. "Yes?" His voice cracked. "That's all you have to say? Yes? What else would you like me to say?" Dennis stared at me for a long moment, then threw the magazine onto the counter. "How long have you known?" "Known what? Don't play games with me. How long have you been sitting on this kind of money while watching me struggle?" I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Struggle? Dennis, you live in a 4-bedroom house in the best part of town. You drive a car that costs more than most people make in a year. Your children attend private school. How exactly have you been struggling?" "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" He began pacing the small office like a caged animal. "The point is that you let me take money from Richard. You let me feel grateful to him, dependent on him, when I could have what? Bought your love?" Dennis stopped pacing and turned to face me. "You offered to help with my business. I turned you down because I thought you were just some broke mechanic who didn't understand real money. And now? Now I find out you could buy and sell Richard 10 times over, and you let me believe you were a failure." I sat down heavily in my desk chair. "Dennis, 3 months ago when you needed that loan, I offered to help. Do you remember what you said to me?" His face flushed darker. "That's different." "How is it different?" "Because you should have told me the truth." "The truth about what?" "About the fact that I developed a revolutionary engine technology in the back room of this shop. About the fact that I spent 12 years working 18-hour days to perfect something that would change the automotive industry forever." My voice was getting louder now, months of suppressed frustration finally breaking free. "Or should I have told you that I did all of it hoping that someday, maybe, my own son would see me as something other than a disappointment?" Dennis opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. "You want to know the truth, Dennis? The truth is that I signed the biggest deal of my life on the same day you called me a failure in front of my grandchildren. The truth is that I've been sitting on enough money to solve every problem you've ever had, watching you choose Richard over me again and again, because I wanted to know if you could ever love me for who I am, instead of what I can provide." "That's not fair, isn't it?" I stood up, my voice deadly calm now. "Let me ask you something, son. Right now, knowing what you know about my net worth, do you love me more than you did yesterday?" Dennis struggled with the question, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Because if the answer is yes," I continued, "then you've just proved my point." "Dad, do you know what I did with my money, Dennis? Do you want to know how I spent the fortune you're so angry about?" He nodded mutely. "I saved Richard's company, Meridian Capital, that mysterious private equity firm that bailed him out. That was me. I spent $15 million to keep Richard afloat because I knew his failure would destroy you financially." Dennis's face went white. "What? Your business loan from Richard? That got converted to an investment deal because I bought out his debt and restructured everything to protect you. You think you succeeded on your own merit, but the truth is, your father, the failure, has been secretly bankrolling your success for months. Sarah honked the horn impatiently outside, but Dennis didn't seem to hear it. Why? He whispered. Because I love you. Because despite everything you've said to me, everything you've done to humiliate me, you're still my son. Because I would rather see you happy and successful while thinking I'm worthless than watch you fail, while knowing I could have prevented it. Dennis sank into the chair across from my desk. I don't understand. If you had all this money, why didn't you show me? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Show you what? My bank statements? Would that have made you proud of me? Would that have made you call me for something other than emergencies? Would that have made you want your children to know their grandfather? Maybe. I don't know. That's the problem, Dennis. You don't know. You don't know me at all. You know Richard. Successful Richard, generous Richard, reliable Richard. But you've never taken the time to know David, your father. That's not true. When was the last time you asked me about my work? Really asked. Not just polite small talk. Dennis was quiet. When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? More silence. When was the last time you brought Emma and Jake here to see where their grandfather works, to meet the people I employ, to understand what I've built with my own hands? Dennis's voice was barely audible. Never. That's right, never. Because in your mind, I was just the failure you had to tolerate, the embarrassment you had to manage, the father who wasn't good enough to compete with Richard. Sarah honked again, longer this time. You should go, I said. Sarah's waiting. Dennis stood up slowly, then paused at the door. Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. There's a difference. What happens now? I looked at my son, this man I had raised and loved and lost somewhere along the way. Now you decide what kind of relationship you want with me, not based on my money, not based on what I can do for you, but based on who we are as people. And if I want to try, if I want to start over, Then you start by understanding that I'm not going to buy your affection, and I'm not going to compete with Richard for your attention anymore. I'm 61 years old, Dennis. I'm tired of begging my own son to love me. Dennis nodded slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Can I call you later? When I've had time to think? You can call me anytime, you always could. After he left, I sat alone in my office, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of my shop. The magazine lay open on my desk, my photograph staring back at me from the glossy pages. For months, I had wondered what would happen when Dennis learned the truth. Now I knew. He was angry, confused, hurt, and probably feeling manipulated. But underneath all that, I had seen something else in his eyes. Respect. Not the desperate, hungry respect of someone who had just discovered they had a wealthy father, but the grudging respect of someone who had realized they had completely misjudged a person they thought they knew. It wasn't love, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was a beginning. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced at the caller ID and smiled for the first time in days. Emma, my granddaughter, calling from Dennis's phone. Hi, Grandpa David. Daddy says you're really smart and that you built something amazing. Can you tell me about it? Maybe it was a beginning after all. 1 year later, I stood in the same dining room where this journey had begun. But everything was different now. The mahogany table still gleamed under Richard's chandelier, but the dynamics around it had shifted in ways I never could have imagined. Dennis sat to my right, not at the far end of the table. Emma and Jake flanked me on the other side, genuinely excited to show me their latest school projects. Margaret smiled more often, and even Richard seemed more relaxed, though I suspected that had more to do with his company's newfound stability than any change of heart about me. Grandpa David, Emma said, holding up a science fair trophy. I won first place for my project on alternative energy sources. I told everyone my grandfather was the one who taught me about hybrid engines. I felt my chest swell with pride. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Did you use the diagrams I drew for you? All of them, Mrs. Patterson said she'd never seen such detailed technical drawings from a student's family member. Jake chimed in. Can you show me how to build that remote-controlled car next weekend? The one that runs on the battery system you designed? Of course. We'll work on it in the shop. These conversations would have been impossible a year ago, not because I lacked the knowledge, but because Dennis had never allowed his children to see me as anything other than a polite stranger they were obligated to acknowledge. The change hadn't happened overnight. After that confrontation in my shop, Dennis had gone through what I could only describe as an identity crisis. He spent weeks avoiding me, then started showing up at the shop unannounced, as if he was trying to reconcile the father he thought he knew with the man he was discovering. "I keep thinking about all the times you tried to help," he had said during one of those awkward visits. "All the times I shut you down because I thought you didn't understand real business." "You weren't entirely wrong," I had replied. "I didn't understand your business, but I understood innovation, problem solving, and hard work. Those skills translate." The real breakthrough came 3 months after the Forbes article, when Dennis's business hit its first major obstacle. A key supplier had backed out of a contract, threatening to derail everything he had built. His first instinct had been to call Richard, but something made him pause. Instead, he called me. "Dad, I need advice. Not money, just perspective." We had spent 4 hours in my office that day, going through his business model, identifying weaknesses, brainstorming solutions. By the end of our conversation, Dennis had a plan that not only solved his immediate problem, but positioned his company for more sustainable growth. "How did you know all that?" he had asked as we finished. "I've been running a business for 30 years, son. The principles don't change just because the scale does." That was the moment I saw something shift in his eyes. Not the realization that I had money, but the recognition that I had wisdom, experience, value that had nothing to do with my net worth. Now, a year later, Dennis called me regularly. Not every day, not out of obligation, but when he genuinely wanted my input or just to talk. He had started bringing Emma and Jake to the shop on Saturdays, where they helped me with simple repairs and learned about engines, hydraulics, and the satisfaction of fixing something with your own hands. "David," Richard said, cutting into my thoughts, "I wanted to thank you again for the advice about the commercial development project. Your suggestions about sustainable building practices made all the difference with the city planning committee." I nodded politely. Richard and I would never be close, but we had reached a kind of détente. He had finally understood that I wasn't competing with him for Dennis's affection. I was just trying to be his father. Margaret leaned across the table. "The kids are so excited about the workshop you're building behind the shop. Dennis says it's going to have all the latest equipment, state of the art," I confirmed. "I want Emma and Jake to have a place where they can explore their interests, whether that's engineering, art, or anything else that catches their imagination." The workshop was my latest project, a 10,000 square foot facility where I plan to teach not just my grandchildren, but any young person interested in learning practical skills. It wasn't charity. It was investment in a future where people understood the value of working with their hands as well as their minds. "Will you teach other kids too?" Jake asked. "If they want to learn. Your generation is going to face challenges we can barely imagine. The more tools you have to solve problems, the better." Dennis had been quiet through most of dinner, but now he spoke up. "Dad, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "Your company, the one that holds all your patents and technology. You're going to need someone to help manage the business side eventually." I raised an eyebrow. "Are you applying for a job?" "Maybe, if you'd have me." The table went quiet. This was the first time Dennis had expressed any interest in working with me rather than simply asking for my advice. "It would mean leaving your current business," I said carefully. "I've been thinking about that too. I built something good, but it's not really sustainable long term. Your technology, though, that could change entire industries. I'd like to be part of that, if you think I'm qualified." I studied my son's face, looking for any sign that this was about money or obligation. What I saw instead was genuine excitement, the same expression he had worn as a child when he was truly interested in something. "We'd be working together every day," I warned. "You'd have to take direction from your old man sometimes." Dennis smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. "I think I can handle that." After dinner, as the family was leaving, Dennis hung back while Sarah loaded the kids into the car. "Dad, there's something I need to say." "Okay." "I know I can't undo the things I said. The years I wasted being angry at you for not being someone you were never supposed to be. But I want you to know that I see you now. Really see you." I felt my throat tighten. "Dennis, let me finish. You're not Richard, and that's not a flaw. Richard is good at making money and managing assets, but you, You create things. You solve problems. You make the world better with your hands and your mind. I want to learn how to do that. You already know how. You built a successful business from nothing, with help I didn't deserve and guidance I was too proud to ask for. He paused. I want to earn my place in your life, Dad. Not because I'm your son, but because I'm worthy of your respect. I pulled him into a hug, the first real embrace we had shared in years. You already are, I said. As I watched them drive away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Contentment. Not the desperate satisfaction of finally being acknowledged, but the quiet peace of relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Thank you for dinner, Grandpa. I love you. Then Jake. Can't wait for next weekend at the shop. And finally, Dennis. Love you, Dad. See you Monday morning. Partner. I walked back into my apartment above the shop, looking around at the modest space I had called home for 15 years. I could afford any house in the city now, any lifestyle I wanted. But this place, surrounded by the tools of my trade and the sound of honest work, felt right. Tomorrow, Dennis would start learning the business that had consumed my nights and weekends for over a decade. Emma and Jake would continue their Saturday visits, their young minds hungry for knowledge I was finally able to share freely. And I would keep doing what I had always done, solving problems, building things, making the world a little better, one innovation at a time. The difference was that now I wasn't doing it alone. I pulled out the original contract from my safe, the document that had started this entire journey. $2.8 billion had bought me many things: security, independence, the ability to help people I cared about. But the most valuable thing it had given me was time. Time for my son to see past his own assumptions and discover who his father really was. Money hadn't bought me love, but it had created the space for love to grow naturally, honestly, in its own time. As I prepared for bed, I thought about that dinner 1 year ago, when Dennis had called me a failure in front of my grandchildren. He hadn't been entirely wrong. I had failed at many things over the years. Failed at my marriage, failed to compete with Richard's lifestyle, failed to make Dennis proud of me for far too long. But I had succeeded at the one thing that mattered most. I had never stopped being his father, even when he stopped being my son. And now, finally, we were both ready to build something new together, something real, something lasting, something worth more than all the money in the world. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.